Bien. Voilà, merci. Bienvenue, bonsoir. Bienvenue à cette conférence de Nanako Umemoto et Jesse Reiser. Nanako Umemoto enseigne la théorie et la critique du projet en master. Elle donne ce soir une conférence avec son partenaire, Jesse Reiser. Leur bureau d'architecture est basé à New York. Nanako Umemoto a étudié à Osaka puis à Cooper Union. Elle a une formation d'architecte et de paysagiste. Jesse Reiser est actuellement professeur associé d'architecture à l'université de Princeton. Ils ont enseigné à Columbia University et donnent régulièrement des conférences aux États-Unis, en Europe et au Japon. Et en parallèle à leur engagement académique, Nanako Umemoto et Jesse Reiser construisent et participent à de nombreux concours. Leur bureau a une très large gamme d'échelles, de la conception de meubles, de construction résidentielle, commerciale, à la très grande échelle de l'aménagement du paysage et des infrastructures. Ils ont gagné en 2000 un important concours pour le Taipei Pop Music Center. Ils ont réalisé plusieurs projets à Dubaï, notamment dans 2 importantes tours et un projet de masterplan. Ils ont aussi obtenu une reconnaissance internationale en remportant le concours de l'aéroport de Shenzhen contre des architectes comme Foster ou Fuxas. Leur projet, finalement, s'est avéré un peu trop challenging pour le jury chinois, malheureusement, mais il a confirmé leur statut de praticien de tout premier plan. En 2000, ils ont été invités à la Biennale de Venise et ils ont présenté une exposition qui s'appelait Trans-Urbanism, Policies and Ecologies. Donc, ils ont gagné aussi 2 prix que je peux mentionner, le prix Chrysler pour l'excellence en design et le Academy Award in Architecture de l'Académie américaine des arts et des lettres. Jesse Reiser et Nanako Umemoto ont organisé leur bureau comme un laboratoire innovant dans lequel les idées sociales, culturelles et structurelles forment un tout et participent d'une architecture très dynamique. Privilégiant la qualité à la quantité, ils s'engagent chacun personnellement dans toutes les étapes de leur projet, de la conception au développement et jusqu'à la mise en œuvre. So, Nanako and Jesse, you are very welcome here tonight. Thank you for your presence and you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cyril, for the kind introduction. It's really fun to be here in such an intimate group. I think we can perhaps speak less formally and try to get into the substance of 4 projects that we're going to present this evening.
We are going to talk about our 014 project in Dubai in depth with references to Shenzhen Airport in China as further development of 014 envelope model. And also we will discuss 2 competition-winning projects in Taiwan. One is a port terminal in Kaohsiung, and the other is Taipei Pop Music Center. The both of the project are well into design process. Kaohsiung is in the construction document phase, and Taipei Pop, after complex negotiation between the music industry, Taipei City, and the federal government, is in schematic design.
Okay, I'll be talking about the first project, the 014 project, which was completed a little over a year ago. And you can advance. One of the things that I guess pulls together the projects we're going to be talking about this evening, aside from being at least 2 of them being competition projects, is the question of context in contemporary work. And for better or worse, these projects of course, deal with places that are quite remote from our office in New York, and therefore we're not talking about the normative or perhaps old-fashioned form of locality, but of about another kind of emerging form, which I would say operates on a number of levels. This diagram here shows the players involved in the creation of the O14 project, none of whom actually are in Dubai with the exception of the developer. So it's a very interesting kind of new situation related to cities that are growing quite rapidly, where they're bringing expertise in from outside, and they converge on these places, and the consequences of that kind of architectural design and city making, I think, are quite different from the kind that would classically have developed even in late modernism. So one could imagine other diagrams as well, just in terms of how we would consider the local, but that's just the creators. These two images, of course, show the stark change of the Dubai of 1991 to that of 2005. I mean, it's really practically a kind of tabula rasa situation where urban plans are brought in. This mainly was the consequence of expertise brought in from England, from large corporations like Halcro next. And a very kind of circumspect way of designing what we in parentheses might call a city. Everything in Dubai past 91 acquired a theme. Each of the zones within the kind of extended Dubai are themed along a fairly monofunctional idea, and while they're inland, they could honestly be called islands, even though they're on the ground. They're actually circumscribed by infrastructure. They're quite isolated from one another. In order to move from one city to the next, you have to get onto a highway, even though they're in very close proximity. So it's a very peculiar form of urbanism, and it produces a very kind of distinct set of consequences. So this rendering that we're showing here was the rendering that we were presented with when we first got involved in competitions in Dubai. We competed against Tom Main and Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid, all of those sort of heavyweights, to design this central zone, a central kind of iconic tower for this development, which was themed towards business, called Business Bay. And the nickname in the office was that we were really almost delving into one of the circles of hell. We were kind of put off in a way by the way in which the theming and then the appropriation of kind of almost a postmodern sense of the city was kind of forced on the competitors. So there was a push for iconic buildings. That was expected of all of the projects, and actually expected of all of the projects we're showing this evening. So the issue of iconicity is not something that we even have to kind of develop, but it's a demand at this point in projects such as these. So this is the reality of the site. This was before, this is that central area I was pointing to. So really still a tabula rasa, but a dream of a city around it. And it actually is beginning, is actually quite developed at this point. That's Nanako with the Kerchiss around their head, stifling heat. All of the arguments I'm making tonight, and this is a bit of shameless advertising, are going to be in our book, which will be coming out in about a month and a half. So there's some fantastic essays by Jeffrey Kipnis and Sylvia Lavin and Brett Steele, and the Architectural Association has been involved all along the process of design as well in the project. Anyway, we can move on. But the thing I'm trying to kind of put forward, too, is not so much the uniqueness of the Dubai site, as much as recognizing that these kinds of cities are popping up along the Pacific Rim. They're more similar, I would say, than they are different. And they then mandate a certain approach to an architecture. Now, you might see this as completely inauthentic city building, as something really negative, but we felt we had to embrace what those conditions were and try to operate in such a way as to at least attempt another kind of architecture within a context such as that. This image, which is from OMA, was their rendering for that central iconic building in Dubai. So they delivered more or less a modernist project to the site, looking back at projects like Mies van der Rohe's renderings in Berlin. But the idea was that they tried to predict what the competitors would produce, that they would produce a very stark kind of modernist prism surrounded by all of the formal excess, the calisthenics that the competitors would, like Zaha, or they assumed us. Our project on the left was actually the United Architects project for downtown Manhattan for Ground Zero. So they figured we'd do something like that. Anyway, it was an interesting piece of politics within the competition. And so, yeah, the Koolhaas project, in terms of approach, would mimic those early modern proposals that would starkly contrast the modernist prism in a 19th century city. We felt that there had to be some other way of dealing with the Dubai context. We felt strongly, as the project developed, that we didn't want to do yet another kind of steel and glass curtain wall building, but that there were other potentials in terms of how to build in that environment, how to produce another kind of architectural expression that didn't get associated with a kind of skyline type, but would, in a sense, merge ground and sky in another kind of architectural model. And in addition to that, as I mentioned, this project was generated by a developer. So there were expectations that we would produce an icon of sorts, but we weren't interested in the typical iconic buildings that we had seen thus far. So that was a challenge. And it, in a sense, was a kind of inverse of the situation imposed by developers when they started doing tall buildings in Chicago in the 19th century, where the developer mandate was to produce the most efficient space. The frame structure of the Chicago buildings, was to produce the most efficient, cost-effective space with the least amount of materials. In Dubai, there was another logic at work, which also dealt with efficiency, but was an efficiency of excess. Of course, it reflected that specific moment, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when there was a lot of money in Dubai. There was a demand by clients to be in unique architecture. They would sacrifice efficiency for some a notion of being in a kind of image. The other aspect of this kind of urbanism was the almost kind of delivery package notion of tower and associated buildings like parking buildings. So this image of Sheikh Zayed Road, which is the sort of central kind of road in Dubai, has a typical sort of deployment of tower on the street frontage, which would be of any kind of style, but kind of a sub-postmodern view generally. And then on the back street would be a typical kind of parking structure, which occupied that whole back area and really made a kind of dead street behind the kind of main drag. So that was also something that developers and builders expected as a kind of norm there. And then, of course, we were handed the design guidelines by Business Bay Development. Again, it was generated by a British firm called Halcrow, which was a big kind of multinational conglomerate, enforcing a kind of postmodern kind of aesthetic on the development. They did try to mandate arcades at the base, some form of a middle, and then a kind of decorated top. And again, suggesting the way in which parking would be kind of associated with the building. So we worked very hard with the developer to kind of rethink those guidelines. We had to work within them at one level, but also cleverly subvert them. So the one thing that, the first thing was the question of the podium base. Instead of seeing it as a base, we thought instead to look towards more modernist antecedents, that base actually could be super elevated, raised above the ground plane, and essentially open up the ground plane, and then furthermore have the availability of another kind of urban space at the top of the podium. This was something actually that for a short time was being developed by OMA for this master plan too. It was a short-lived association, but we thought it was a fantastic idea that you could have active, not only active ground plane, but these podia, which were mandated, could be connected and then develop this other strata of life in the city. So it's still there in the project, although sadly the other buildings basically don't, basically wall it off. But it's part of the kind of ideological dimension of the project, I would say. The idea of the arcade also had to be rethought. And our notion was not to make it an applied base, but to essentially provide the space for the arcade. It wouldn't be signaled by a base, but more by a clearing away from the lobby space, and one could enter it, but there wouldn't be a kind of classical stratification of the tower that you would find in the arcade, but it would work as such. And again, in super elevating the base, we argued successfully with the developer that we could eliminate the parking that's typically placed in here, make it, because it's on the water's edge, that they could make a lot more money with commercial space or develop the spaces inside that super elevated podium rather than filling it with cars. So we successfully kind of argued a below ground parking in this scenario as well. So essentially, in effect, we're trying to open up both the ground plane, this is a waterfront esplanade, and then make available this second level of inhabitation, which could theoretically be connected. The other part of the project that I would want to open up here is what we are attempting to do with the effect of the architecture, which I kind of mentioned obliquely earlier. And I go back to some of the writings, specifically a work by Walter Benjamin that I'm sure all you know, called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And I was struck rereading it when he talked about what the original sort of notion of a place was, which, like a mountain, which he gave as an example, produces the kind of effect of a distance when you look at it. That original kinds of places that are not kind of susceptible to production, these produce a strange kind of effect, which he calls that of a distance. And I began to realize that those kinds of potentials that one typically would associate with natural objects are suddenly being are possible to play around with in architecture now, given the new tools that we have available. We can produce a kind of second nature, I would say, in terms of the appearance of the building, which produces a kind of uncanny effect between the artificial and the natural. I mean, that's also a question of how one uses things like gradient fields in design, continuous variation, and so forth. But you get these strange effects, which I would say are more a question of management than of composition. And they produce a very different kind of skyline object when one is dealing, say, with a tower. And I think that's part and parcel of the way things are being produced now, that we're not really talking about originals versus copies anymore, but that we work in iterative models where we do a lot of variations of the design, exploring different possibilities in the way the building can and the forces moving through it can be read. So there is really no original here, but it's rather a field of possible iterations, which we would finally converge on as being the best in the project. There's also the question of how these buildings of this kind might relate to context, and I give this example of two kind of comedians that in a way relate to architectural approaches. One is the work of Woody Allen. There was a film many years ago called Zelig, where there was a kind of chameleon-like character who basically became anything he got close to. So an arch example of contextualism, a person or an architecture that tries to blend in wherever he is. And so the Piano Tibayu Cultural Center, in a way, flirts with this idea of looking at a contextual architecture and then mixes it with a kind of high-tech model, and this is the kind of result you get. Then there would be other ways, though, I think, of looking at context, which deals with an embrace of ambiguity. And I give another comedian, this is Peter Sellers playing Chance the Gardener in a movie called Being There, where, in fact, he's always saying the same thing, but then whoever he's coming into contact with reads a completely different story into his simple sentences. So I like to think that our approach is closer to that than that of than Woody Allen, let's say. And I think it also has to do with an embrace not only of computation, which I think is actually fairly secondary in the project, quite frankly, but to look at what one would call the minor arts, and to recognize that the minor arts are probably, in some sense, the first international style, if you will. I mean, that baskets or basket weaving cross cultures all over the world. They immediately associate the project with being local, but in fact, they're an international structure. Next. And so the project both resonates with those kinds of models, but equally gets associated with, image of carbonation, or in terms of performance, bone, or natural forms, or basket, laundry baskets, or even outside of our own interpretation, people on the web immediately connected our project to Melnikov's house in Moscow. And indeed, there were really interesting resonances, retrospectively, even crossed into a kind of expressionism, which I thought was fascinating. And of course, there are things that are simply out of one's control. Next. So I'll advance now into the building. Quite simple. It's a 22-story project. There's an exoskeleton of concrete which does all of the kind of vertical support and takes care as well most of the lateral forces on the tower. So because this is a concrete kind of exoskeleton, like a nuclear reactor shell, the core actually could be fairly lightweight because almost all of the lateral forces were taken by this exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is about 1 meter away from the slab edge. So there's a glazing line here, and what we call the tongues, which then connect to the shell. So there's a void space. The meter was based on a purely pragmatic consideration that that's enough space for a window washer to get in behind the shell to clean the glass. And then there was also a measure of economy, because we didn't have to deal with the problematics of putting glazing into the holes, but that we could use a fairly standard window wall that would basically go, span from slab top to slab bottom. So it solved a number of problems, both technical and in terms of crafting this project, by separating the glazing. But there was an earlier set of iterations that were far more conventional that I should just touch on. Everything moved so quickly in Dubai in terms of the demands of the developer that the first iteration of the tower actually mixed residential and office. So the kind of working notion in this very early model, which was more morphic, was to do a more conventional column and slab structure with an applied curtain wall. And then the cruciform shape at the top would handle the residential, in this case, a series of duplex apartments. And then the project would sort of belly out and widen to accommodate the office space. Well, in the event, it became all office space, and we also had a kind of crisis in terms of the direction the design was taking, and then shifted to a completely different model, which was the exoskeleton project. So this sort of project is really an anti-frame model. There's a moment in a really wonderful essay by Colin Rowe called Chicago Frame, where he departs from the frame model, and then he starts talking about this peculiar project, really great project by Frank Lloyd Wright, called the St. Mark's Tower. And again, retrospectively, our project probably belongs more to this lineage. In this case, of course, the tree form of this project concentrates the structure towards the center, and then you get branching trays that come out of this central tree. In our case, it's almost the inverse. That tree has expanded to kind of become the periphery, and then the slabs hang in and connect to the central core. But I think it belongs to that kind of lineage, away from the frame model and the kind of the older 19th century derivatives, or even the new versions of frame that you see in Dubai. So this notionally is what happened in the project, that it starts with a column field, core, facade. That idea got pulled to the outside, and then the envelope becomes pockmarked with holes, which provide about 40% openness, more or less the same as that one would find in the normative building, but with a very different distribution. And as we developed the project, there of course was the necessity of how we would make connections from this podium structure, which was a two-story structure down below, in and through the tower. So we devised a series of bridges that connect to the podium, and they go through the holes and then connect to the inner parts of the slab, but actually two separate buildings, structurally distinct. The other thing that was really interesting at that moment in the project was that we went from a shell that tapered continuously to a hard change of scale of the shell. So it went from 60 centimeters down at that podium level to 40. So we got an interesting detail in the holes in that transition zone. Do you want to go back a second? So I would want to be honest about this. The next. Yeah. As a consequence of that separation, our mechanical engineer told us early on that we would be able to have a real benefit in terms of shading and cooling of the building. Of course, we knew that the shading would be highly effective, but we weren't aware until he pointed it out that you would get a chimney effect in that gap that actually would substantially lower the cooling costs of the building. And once we found that out, we then worked to really, within the design, to optimize that potential. But that leads to a larger question about the issue of sustainability in relation to design, which I think has been troubling me. It's really something that's very much on the minds of American architects. I'm not sure how it's being played in Switzerland, but I came to realize that if you're dealing with a body like Leeds in America, where you have to meet certain numerical performance standards, and you start to look at the architecture that's actually winning these LEED awards, they're practically indifferent to the architectural expression. In other words, you have Bob Stern on the one hand with the George Bush Presidential Library, kind of postmodern neoclassical project, or Tom Main's project. Both meet the numerical demands, but they couldn't be more alike architecturally, which when you think about it, is actually a really good thing, that there isn't any sort of codified, sustainable style, so to speak, but it's purely based on those issues of performance. So that, I think, in a sense, is a liberating condition, rather than thinking that one would have to do an architecture that represented sustainable values. It's far more open than that. So I think this is, just an animation of the cooling effect. And I'd also want to, begin to talk about the specific aims behind the expression and the aesthetic of the building in relation to that idea of the artificial natural. So, next. So, we realized that as the project developed, it got volumetrically relatively simple. It was just an extruded, kind of soft cruciform. And I remember seeing, these kinds of monolithic structures, like the Pyramid of Cestius in Rome, where you really don't have a clear idea of how big that monolithic form is, especially if the day is misty. It could look enormously huge, and then when you get up close to it, you realize it isn't all that big at all. So that was a really interesting potential for the project, to deal with the monolithic. And then on the other side, to deal with something that was highly figured, having excessive features like this toad, which it basically has a kind of disruptive camouflage pattern on it. So in thinking through the use of the diagrid, one of the things that we were playing around with was to try not to be able to read the floor heights clearly. That if we, so on the left is the more kind of typical correlation, say, between the crossing points of the diagrid and the floor slabs, where you'd get equally spaced connections. We deliberately scrambled that. We made those patterns very much out of phase. And so there were a whole series of consequences that flowed from that move, one of which is that it becomes very hard to read how tall the building is. And also that you get very asymmetrical connections to the outside, because basically the slabs connect to wherever they're solid. So a very different kind of spatial effect when you go under and in between that skin, because it's possible to look up and see it. So this was a kind of proof of concept. There are bloggers who are trying to correlate holes kind of described in the early renderings and heights to ones that were in the actual building and construction. Next. And we again, through the iterative process, we're really trying to find a way of not reinforcing the load paths visually in the project, but to create a series of discontinuous zones of solid that would finally trickle down to what is actually a very regular column grid in the structure below. So more or less the spacing of these solids when this surface is peeled around correlates to the regular grids in the parking structures. But that we would find a very kind of devious way to bring the loads down in the pattern. So this is an unfolded view of the geometry from the inside, and those horizontal dashes are connections to slab. So there's an effect as a consequence of the kind of move to irregularity. And so contrasting this with kind of typical facade on 6th Avenue in Manhattan, where you have very clear perspectival diminution, which kind of reflects back on the subject as a kind of sole kind of owner of that view, to the variable perspectives, the kind of contractions and expansions of this produce a number of almost competing energies on the surface of the building when you look at the oblique. And it reminded me of some of the illusions that were part of even the kind of op art pop in the 60s, where this is from Yellow Submarine, the kind of nowhere man space, where up, down, right, left becomes very ambiguous. We also were very concerned about how people worked, what the atmosphere of the office could be, especially in the future. So this is a kind of quintessential image of being pigeonholed in an office with your own cubicle in the gridded floor plan, a kind of anomie and alienation. And so we also were trying to loosen up that relationship between the order of the plan and fenestration, and then how people might begin to occupy the space of the office. Next. So in contrast to that more kind of organized plan, which frankly, aside from the kind of frame model, also gets reinforced in a period where all storage was bulky and large and immediately had to key into the grid as well. The proposition here was that increasingly, and since this is a building with high turnover, the technologies of storage are going to get lighter and lighter. Therefore, there are other potential ways of occupying an office floor and of organizing furniture and so forth. And that would be further enhanced by dealing with a non-uniform envelope rather than one that basically ordains the same homogeneous wrapper all the way around. So you get very strange and interesting views out, and ones that, because the shell is some distance away from the edge of the wall, allows one to look up and down obliquely, as well as in the kind of scan that you would find in the normative office building. So a very different experience of the context optically. And then pulling out, there was also a very interesting phenomena, which isn't just related to our project, but I think is part and parcel of the use of computation these days, where I think people are already pointing out that it's very hard to distinguish the renderings of a project from the built project. And that was certainly true in the kind of development of 014, where you get the most sort of material expression during construction. And then once the building was finished, at least for a certain number of months, this incredible kind of ideality of the surface, almost looking like the rendering. Now it's in the forced phase with all of the aging and the desert dust, and it's starting to look more like a kind of strange desert plant, I think. But it's a very interesting kind of evolution, I would say, and it's an impersonal one. The other thing that we began to explore in the genesis of the building was the issue of its materiality and its relationship to the geometry. On the left is an analysis done by Princeton students and the engineer Guy Nordenson for the Tall Building Show at Museum of Modern Art of the World Trade Center, the one that went down in 2001, by the engineer Les Robertson. And he used something like 15 different alloys of steel, strength, in order, and then the color coding basically kind of charts that. But in order to keep the facade totally regular, right? So different force zones and then different strengths in order to kind of maintain homogeneity. We realized that we were sort of on the other end of the spectrum in regards to this. And so what we were exploring really was an assumed kind of extreme redundancy of structure, which gave us a lot of flexibility. So we went for the highest strength concrete and the reinforcements such that we could really gain a lot of flexibility in the way we could modulate the size of holes and their position. So I think they're part of this, a connected spectrum. It's not totally different, but it's a different way of thinking through those relationships. So these are, both of them are tube structures, more or less, World Trade and ours. But one is, quite regularized, and ours deals with regularity related to the irregular. So I'm going to pass this to Nanako, who will talk about Shenzhen Airport.
I will talk about Shenzhen Airport for a short time. And this Shenzhen Airport was definitely coming out of all 14 buildings. So we further developed the exoskeleton in horizontal forms. But also, same time, the client asked us to design only outer envelopes because plan form and organization of the program was set, done by other architects. So the challenge here was that maintaining outer diagonal grid consistent for the glazing, and by manipulating inner skin and reacting to the local zones, program inside and outside, and the movement of sun and flow of people. It creates the zone of differences within the field of the shell.
So the outer cladding and glazing unit is exactly the same, and all of the change happens in the sectional projection of the whole.
And also near the gangway or some localizing area where the lots of people's activities were, each opening is reacting to the movement of people and the view of the outside. And the departure hall was different because we changed the size of hole, but also changing the angle of the hole. So we didn't need to keep outer diagonal field consistent. And in the case of O14, we came up with the module system of openings because we thought it would be so expensive to do everything different. But at the end of the day, it was easier to make a new one for each hose. It meant that we could have an infinite variation of holes. Here is the construction shot early in the building showing that the diagrid of diagrid of reinforcement and a digital cut form for the void form for the fenestration. Shell changed the thickness from 60 centimeter to the base at the base and to the 40 centimeter at the top. So top view, the rooftop view, each hall frames different views. An overall view of the whole buildings. The podium is facing to Dubai Creek and connected to the tower with multiple bridges. Main entrance is from the roadside. The building give the complete different relationship with the floor and openings compared with normal buildings. And the podium is connected to the building with multiple bridges. The bridge that pass through the exoskeleton and connect with the slab of the building. The restaurant occupies the tower at the podium top and extends to the outdoor dining area. This is the arcade space in between the exoskeleton and the window wall at the base. Also, side slides show the slab connection tongue to the shell when you look up. And the view is looking down the field of the tongue between space of exoskeleton and the window walls. The view of the outdoor public space and arcade. O14 and its neighboring construction with the Burj Khalifa in the background, which is the tallest building now in the world. Here is the detail of exoskeleton at the roof level. The slide shows the changing geometry of the opening as they move over the convex and concave surface of the shell. The wider view of open roof deck. These views from under the podium shows how it is independently supported. It also shows the bridges coming out of two levels of podium. And lobby desk, it took quite long time, like a year and a half to make this desk, and building was completed in 2.5 years. So, and the reflection of outer wall in the lobby frosted glass wall. This slide shows the podium facade. Okay.
Okay, I'll talk about the competition that we won about 1.5 years ago for the Taipei Pop Music Center. It was a very interesting kind of moment in the history of Taiwanese competitions. For the first time, the Taiwanese government started to feel a keen sense of competition from countries like mainland China, especially in regards to their music industry. So the Taiwanese basically evolved the first versions of Asian pop, and it became a model that spread to the continent. And they're now actively seeking to support the music industry, how they turn out groups, and to create a place where this would happen in Taipei in a concentrated way, and also be a place that would equally be a mediated place, so that it was assumed from the get-go that this kind of project would have to deal with mass media, with the televisual in the design. So two, in a way, conflicting demands. One, to create a kind of physically embodied urban space that had to deal with not just the pop music industry, but with the fabric of the city and other uses and people. And on the other hand, again, kind of pushed to make an iconic project that would represent Taiwanese pop. So the site is presently kind of derelict industrial area that they want to redevelop. They're going to be doing some large towers, residential towers flanking the site, and the mandate of the competition was to somehow engage and join two really different site conditions. One, a super kind of long and narrow one, and then across the Xinsheng road corridor, this wider site. Most of the competitors decided to consolidate their building on the kind of roughly square-shaped site, but we felt very strongly that this project was not just about a big building, but that it had to engage the urbanism of this place, and that there would have to be an exploration not only of the buildings and their uses per se, but of creating what we called a kind of new ground for the project, to mix, in other words, notions of landscape design, infrastructure, and architecture. So that meant really working intensively not only with a single surface, but to deal with the multiple levels in the city, to create an elevated kind of flexible park space, have that engage this first iteration of the main hall. This is a rendering during the competition. We felt also that we weren't going to be designing a normal theater building that was just a theater, but that there was an opportunity to house the music industry executives and their really competing firms in a tower that would have direct communication with the back of house facilities of this theater. So the idea here in this project that we weren't creating a center that would, receive groups internationally like U2. They would probably have such big crowds that they would come and use a stadium. But this was more for a medium to large size group. At that point in the competition, I believe the main hall was around 3,000 people, and then they asked for the provision for outdoor performance for close to 11,000 people. So kind of big bridging structure. The main components are this stage, which is actually a mobile stage, what we call the robot, the main hall that you saw the section of earlier, and then the Hall of Fame space, which was basically conceived of as a kind of vertical museum space with seating carved out of the face of the cube. And that seating would actually be start engaging this stage, and I'll show you that in a second. So the urbanistic concept really was that we're dealing with a set of very old models that we would, in a sense, mutate. So a stadium notionally has a single focus. If you turn the stadium into a circus, there are multiple foci, multiple places of interest. But the problem of both the stadium and the circus is that they're quite circumscribed. They don't really connect to their context. So our idea was to basically take the circus model, sort of elevation of a very old Roman model, create public access from both ends, and then further to branch that model and have it basically cross over the road dividing the two sites, and then to place these three kind of major object buildings on the site. So I don't know if this you may have to click on the. This is the animation showing notionally how the project of the surface developed first, and then the components on the surface. And I would also want to talk about this relative to the recent history. I mean, its closest antecedent in a way is the Yokohama Port Terminal by FOA, but increasingly in dialogue with people of my generation, beginning to realize that this sort of single surface or topological project is not adequate, and that actually really interesting way of engaging kind of created ground and object buildings is possible. So, but it's part of that legacy, a kind of common legacy, recent exploration. As I mentioned before, the building had to be kind of telegenic, I would say, be an icon, but next. The question of its iconicity was also something that we were, in a very different way than, say, 014 trying to explore. So that rather than a kind of fixed icon like Taipei 101, and there's a newscaster who is ageless in the United States, you probably don't know, named Bob Costas, who's sort of like the kind of human equivalent of Taipei 101. Rather than that, the Madonna model seemed really interesting, that she's always the same, but she's always different. So how to deal with something that's the same, maybe geometrically, but then mutable in terms of how you deal with media, how you deal with change, was a really important issue, especially because it's a place that has a constant, turnover of acts and of events, both related to pop and not. So our thought about the project was to make a both-and project, basically that we could, in one mode of the project, when this stage, which I mentioned is mobile, is at the end of the site, one can host a large concert, but then as one moves the stage, which was proposed on rails, you might get a smaller venue, and then following in its wake, one could have the opportunity of having fully public space, non-paying space. And then finally, in the most kind of compressed form, when this stage is actually kissing this cube where there's seating, this would become an entirely open public park without payment. So the idea was that you'd have a kind of flexible urban model rather than a fixed one, and varying degrees of openness or closedness depending upon the scale of the venue or the demand to have night markets or other kinds of civic functions unrelated to pop music. So this is one of the very early renderings showing the outdoor performance space with a lighting net above. And then this in another modality when it's essentially an open kind of public park. And this view shows that moment when the stage actually kisses the cube, so you could have very intimate, small-scale performances. And then a view out of that cube towards the site, in a different time. So there was always a kind of desire to kind of deal with, this notion that one would have to host multiple events and scales in this place to keep it active, on a 24-hour basis, and to look through what is possible to see given proximity of this changing stage. The main hall, as I mentioned, is really a kind of hybrid building. The fly tower, in a way, is super exaggerated to become the office space for the music industry. So artists have direct access to producers back of house, and then there's a completely different kind of universe happening front of house for the general public and their interaction with the artists. And this is a sliver space. So it was a matter of creating not just a single surface anymore, but really a thickened ground, so that commercial space would occupy both the kind of street level, but also occupy that sandwich as well. So a kind of mix. Now the project has changed, and it's changed again. There were issues about the noise code. So this is one of the iterations of the project where we developed an acoustical shell that basically covered the outdoor space, but again tried to keep the connections urbanistically under the shed when there wasn't a concert being staged. So doors would come down and basically seal the project during performance, and then it became a kind of an open shed, all-weather shed, when not. And then this is yet another development. This is the most recent, so this is more or less a sketch. But the pop music industry demanded a major increase of program for the main hall. They eliminated an earlier demand for a Broadway musical type of stage, just in case they didn't get enough acts. And so the project for the main hall has changed considerably. Offices have moved across the street. So this is a very tentative kind of sketch where we are now in redeveloping the project. But let's move now to the animation that we showed in competition. And then Nanako will end the presentation with our latest Kaohsiung project.
Okay, so I'm going to explain our Kaohsiung Port Terminal project. Actually, Kaohsiung Port Terminal project we actually won last year, but we are almost ending this project. We are at the end of the construction document, and after that we are going into the construction. So we started later, but we are ending, and then we are going to construction earlier than Taipei Pop Music Center because our client is the people who use the building. But in the case of Taipei Pop Music Center, we have a few clients and they can't agree on each other, so that it took us 2 years to really start working on the project. This is international port terminal in southern port city of Kaohsiung. Instead of the port terminal sitting alone in isolation, we try to activate the water edges by connecting infrastructure of the city and ocean. The container port of Kaohsiung is one of the largest in East Asia and largest in Taiwan. Kaohsiung is also one of the largest industrial centers in Taiwan. However, recently industry has given way to the post-industrial use, and so the port is being revamped for the public. The site was designed as a former industrial dock. It suffered from the segmentation of uses of the public like many other cities. Waterfront is cut off from the public by 2D monofunctional planning. Our case, our schematic concept brings these different issues together, all necessary uses, segmenting them in sections. Sandwich with terminal use in the middle, public above, and a service below. Connection from the departure and arrival to the gangway to the ship, and service function on the ground level, as you see, and public on top of the podium. At the scale of the port terminal building, these surfaces stack up in sections, allowing for the public terminal and service function to work simultaneously. The view from the land side, the departure entrance to the port terminal, vehicular drop-off, the cars and taxis and buses. The ground level is the arrival hall. It is accommodate the taxi queues and bus stop and entrance of the underground parking lot. The view of the public boardwalk which connects to the waterfront, but also this boardwalk supposed to continue and then create a water edge parks in the future. The main level at 6 meters is the departure hall. Allow direct access on level to the waiting area and boarding ramps. The platform is shaped like a manifold branching from one central space to the central space to the each functional lobes. The G3 level of the terminal intersect with public waterfront boardwalk. This elevated pedestrian boardwalk hits the top of the terminal lobes, and it's creating zone of commercial uses such as restaurants and shops. These levels are accessed through the escalator in a poche space of the wall. The all vertical movement system happen between the walls, keeping the main volume free. The slide show the entrance from the waterfront and the entrance from the land side. Office tower relationship to the public space, 13.5 meters to the top of the podium. The physical model shows the terminal entrance, the departure and arrival hall, and office tower. The view of the office tower is sitting on the podium. The view of the main row and connection to the boardwalk. And the view from the one of the row restaurant, one can look at activity inside. The fenestration is important not only to bring the light into the building, but to the project light out. This is especially important for the building at the water edge. We are designing the dynamic lighting system now. The podium of the terminal space is that when ship is not there, the terminal is dead space. The Kaohsiung Port Terminal offers the public space stay always active when ship is not there. Usually these ocean liner comes once or 2 weeks, so that when ship is not there, nobody is around. The space is not conventional open column field, but changing the space direct towards the gate. That simplified section shows that for the departing passenger, they stay on the level, but also they can see the function of boardwalk above. So if they have a time, they can use those amenities. The double skin house the circulations and the mechanical systems and the structural system. Also create airflow for the cooling the building. The branching cantileveling lobes and the diagonal structure for the tower. The land side, the volume are part of a continuous system which engages the edge of the boardwalk and connected back to the waterfront, which connect to the further waterfront park. The long view from the harbor explore the iconic possibility of the building.
you. I'm happy to take questions if you're interested. Yes.
Thanks for your different slides. I'm wondering about what this process, how does it work? For example, potentiality, the growth ladder, and the six-part ladder, model making this process.
Yes.
And then there's model making by controlling the gamma. And I just I just saw so wonderful dynamic forms in your work, and just I want to know how you work for making these dynamic forms in your work.
I guess we kind of share that interest in the physical model making and the drawing with Gary. The office, of course, does and is known for its kind of use of computation, but it's only one aspect of the design work. So initial schemes, either they start with physical models or 3D models are drawn in the computer, but they're always checked with a physical, because we find that the distortion, say, of the perspective window never really give you, what the actual artifact is going to be. So our process is really a kind of pragmatic one, I would say. We use the tools that best sort of solve the problem at hand. But there's a lot of very classical making in the office and drawing. Yeah.
How about you draw last time you can?
Yeah.
Sure.
A lot.
A lot of hand drawing, a lot of adjusting, and then also a lot of adjusting of contours when people are. If somebody is modeling, we're always sketching and then suggesting changes and adjustments. There's a lot of work. It's actually. We were talking about this the other night. There's actually a lot of 2D determination in our work, rather than, in a sort of an open sense of 3D modeling. Everything is assessed more or less from 2D, many 2D projections to adjust, those kinds of forms, that kind of form making. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is about the outsourcing project.
Uh-huh.
Well, you just talked about this interest in the national forms like the clouds and the snow on the mountain. I thought that this sense of fantasy that comes out of this course, it might be because of this decision to use geometrical forms and sort of. I need this idea to limit the nature, but with sort of pure geometrical forms. I wanted to know about the study that you did and decisions that were made to just shaping this envelope with this shapable forms, like you talked about the forms of slabs, but more about the geometrical studies that you forming the forms on the envelope or the under SQL.
Well, it's like kind of managing a whole complex of demands at once, I would say. At once, of course, there are the sort of parameters that are set up by the structural engineer in terms of proximity of any of those holes and how this would perform structurally. So there were kind of guidelines that were set up at the beginning in terms of how far we can push and pull and how we could vary. And then, there were just constant iterations which actually went from an initial interest in doing everything with Rhino scripting, with scripting gradients, which actually were too mechanical for us. We were actually dissatisfied with the scripting model. So then we had to, go to more kind of direct means of beginning to work. So in a funny way, I mean, if once all of the parameters were set, there was actually a tremendous amount of freedom in how you could vary. So one could work, in a sense, almost in a painterly way, knowing that there were all the quantitative issues were being satisfied. There was still a lot of latitude. So again, I guess there wasn't one method, but there were sort of balancing many sort of issues at once when we were working through. We would do an iteration geometrically. It would go back to the structural engineer. They would run the calculations. They would see where there were hot spots or where we had to change things. It would come back to us. We would be dissatisfied with it. We would adjust it again. So there was a continuous back and forth from the beginning, really, with the structural people. Well, I mean, I guess there were technological sort of constraints, and then there was the desire to produce a certain kind of atmosphere and an effect in the outside of the building as well, while at the same time, having the 40% openness that was required and doing all of the things that would probably be associated with a more normative structure. So, yeah, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. Finally, yeah. Yeah.
What is the relation between the computational work and say your hand drawing work, more and more sketch writing? Which one is more important, and how do they kind of relate to each other? Because once you start
yes.
like hand draw, you kind of basically infect the computational.
Of course, yeah. No, we absolutely infect computation. I mean, we don't see it as a pure form at all from our point of view. It's not so much about the rigor of the method, but about being satisfied with the results. So it's less about a rigorous tracking of process, absolutely, but more a pragmatic approach in terms of what the final effects would be. Yeah. So yeah, from the standpoint of a purist, it's absolutely contaminated. Oh, it is. I mean, well, I think it was, I mean, to kind of talk concretely, the problems we were encountering with the scripting was also even one of time that the scripts would kind of define rules for, say, producing a gradient over a certain number of holes with a certain amount of change. And the typical sort of situation there was that you would get a fairly mechanical result. You could, I mean, this is part of the ethic of the project. You could smell the system, it looked too mechanical. So it meant localizing the change more and more and more, and then it became absurd because the poor guy was writing code, for single lines of holes in order to get what we wanted. So it became, in a way, cumbersome and unrealistic. So I don't know. It's hard to see because it all, of course, has been unified from, in terms of the geometry, the type of geometry and the materials. But a lot of work was done in order to try to sort of defeat the obvious sort of reading of the load paths and also to vary the gradients. And it really was more like painting at the end of the day. Yes?
Comparing the two projects in Taiwan,
Uh-huh.
this is a totally different thing. You have the one project which is the music center.
Yes.
Before you probably knew there are a lot of different developers, maybe a lot of different politics.
Mm.
Concerning in the competition. And the other one is the sports as well.
Mm-hmm.
One developer.
Yeah, one.
Can
Yeah.
you
Right.
all these graphical things with the light shows and stuff.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you receive or see a competition that's in Rome, like in
Mhm.
how do you judge the extremity where you can go as thinking about the possibility,
Right.
the actual idea being produced,
Yes.
or just having the biggest impact,
Mhm.
and knowing that later on you still will come down to a more realistic,
Mhm.
more probable.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the general ethic in the office, for better or worse, is to try to really make it, to do the most, I don't know if it's the most extreme, but we would want to do the project that we would do anyway, and not try to second guess, the developers, or to try to kind of overly accommodate the reality. And then the task is the kind of productive battle between the realistic constraints and demands and the status of the project. But to start with the bar low means the project gets really banal really fast, and they almost don't want to do it. So yeah, I mean, our tendency is to really kind of push as hard as we can in the direction of what we would do anyway. I don't know if that answers your question, but there were different consequences, right? I mean, the Kaohsiung project was basically kind of owned by the head of the port authority of that. He runs the whole thing, and so he identified with the project, became its champion. Whereas Taipei Pop deals with 3 or 4 bodies who actually can't stand each other. Well, one doesn't really know it, in a competition. Realistically, also one judges the jury. If the jury would even be receptive to our doing a submission at all, or whether it's a waste of time. Sure. That was probably a more immediate set of concerns than the administration and the pop music industry and so forth. That was sort of never made explicit until much, much later. So, yeah. Okay.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.